Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Renaissance Society Friday Forum. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Elina Niño, and she will be talking about to be or not to be. Is there a choice? Today's presentation is being recorded, and it will be available for viewing later on the web. For this webinar, the chat feature has been disabled. If you have any questions you would like to ask our presenter, please use the Q&A button instead. Dr. Elina Niño is a cooperative extension specialist with the Department of Entomology and Nematology at UC Davis. Her passion is bees, especially improving honeybee health and particularly honeybee queen health. She teaches numerous beekeeping workshops and developed the first master beekeeper program that serves California and neighboring states. She is also involved in precision beekeeping using cutting-edge technologies. Dr. Niño has a fascinating knowledge of bees that will surely make you fall in love with them. So welcome, Dr. Niño.
Thank you, Chip. Before we begin, I want to just thank Tom, actually, who has invited me originally to join you at the Friday Forum and tell you about my passion, which are honeybees. And before we actually begin with my presentation, I wanted to ask you some questions. So hopefully Chris will now be able to put up some poll questions that I would like you to answer, if you don't mind, because this is something that I would normally ask you if we were all together in a room versus me looking at sort of a bunch of black boxes. So once we have folks answered the questions, I'll read the answers to you because, again, I'm very, very curious. And one of those questions, as you can imagine, the last question is a question that I get very commonly when I tell folks that I work with honeybees. So I just kind of wanted to throw it back at you and see how many of you have been stung by a bee. And it doesn't have to be a honeybee, actually, any bee. And hopefully everybody here present will be able to see the screen and the presentation that I'm sharing. And I believe
looks good.
Great. Perfect.
We've got about 90% of people voted, so just a few more seconds and then we'll end the poll. Yeah, it looks like that's about it. Let's go ahead and I'll end this and show you the results.
Ooh, perfect. We have, let's see, have you ever kept honeybees? We do have some beekeepers in the room, about 8% of you or 9 people in the room. I'm going to say a room on screen are beekeepers or have been beekeepers, have kept bees. We have about 19 people who have at least visited a honeybee colony and went inside and checked the honeybee colony. So that's great. I'm excited. And have you ever been stung by a bee? Oh my goodness. 86% of you said, yes, you've been stung by a bee. It's not fun, is it? But I'm also excited that I have some, as I said, fellow beekeepers in the crowd. I'm also excited to see that there are very few of you who have kept bees, which means that I can pretty much tell you anything and you won't know any better. I'm kidding. I will, of course, only tell the truth and nothing but the truth. So let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. As Chip mentioned, I'm an extension specialist for University of California. In fact, I'm the only one in the state of California who does a lot of work with beekeepers. And of course, we do a lot of work as a lab with other growers. And we will see in a second why. Oh, let's see. Oh, there we go. So the goal of the Niño Bee Lab is to characterize various stressors that we'll talk a little bit about during the presentation whether those are biotic or abiotic stressors that can be affecting colony health. And most importantly, I'm very interested in, as a lab, we're really interested in discovering solutions and finding solutions to those potential stressors that the bees are exposed to, and helping beekeepers better be able to deal with those stressors. Now, because I'm the face that you're seeing and I'm the person that you are listening to, I also wanted to make sure to point out that I'm not the only person at UC Davis who does work with pollinators. So we actually have a group that we named California Pollinator Consortium, and these are some of our members. Dr. Neil Williams is our wild bee expert. Dr. Rachel Vanette is a pollinator plant interaction expert. Dr. Brian Johnson does quite a few studies, understanding better what is the molecular underpinning of division of labor in honeybees. We have Dr. Stacy Combs, who does a lot of work on understanding physiology and specifically flight behavior of bees in general, so not just honeybees. Dr. Santiago Ramirez is doing some really neat work with orchid bees. And I should point out that Dr. Santiago Ramirez and Dr. Brian Johnson, both of them have interest in understanding better where the Africanized honeybees are at this point in the state of California. And also Dr. Lisa Tell, who is a slightly different interest or has slightly different research interest than us, but she's working on hummingbirds. So we have quite a diverse group of researchers who are doing quite different and really interesting research on a variety of different pollinators and other organisms. In addition to our colleagues at UC Davis, we actually just welcomed 2 more colleagues who have started working in the USDA Bee Lab in Davis. It's a newly established bee lab. And if you can take a quick look at the photo, I'm hoping, or at the PowerPoint, I'm hoping that you were able to see my mouse. And the USDA Bee Lab is not actually a physical building yet. These are trailers where the researchers have their offices and lab space. And what's really neat about this concept is that these trailers are actually potentially be able to be moved. So if they're able to be moved, then these researchers can actually go and follow the honeybees and beekeepers as they do their pollination and honey production cycle. So the 2 researchers that are brand new to the USDA Bee Lab in Davis are Dr. Arathi Seshadri. She does quite a few studies on understanding the pollinator nutrition, and also does some really neat work that I'll briefly mention later on understanding how phytochemicals impact bee health. And Dr. Julia Fine is a toxicologist, really, and she's doing some interesting work on understanding the impacts of pesticides on honeybees, and also a lot of work on understanding impact of various stressors on queen bees specifically. So that's just a brief introduction to the people behind the work that's being done at UC Davis. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about why we're here and the organism that has brought us all together tonight or this afternoon. And those are pollinators. Pollinators, as you know, are essential to agriculture worldwide. And approximately 90% of wild flowering plants actually depend on animal pollination. About 75% of our food crops worldwide, so not just California, not just United States, but worldwide, require or benefit from some sort of pollinator movement of pollen. Now, when I say pollinator in this instance, I don't necessarily mean just bees. There are a slew of other pollinators that can help pollinate plants. Those include flies, those include beetles, and a variety of other animals. And in fact, because we are humans and we like to sort of think about things in terms of dollars, somebody has come up with a dollar amount and put it to anywhere between $235 to $577 billion, which is the estimated value of pollinator-dependent crops globally. Just like we have a variety or a varied group of researchers at UC Davis, that's how we have a varied group of pollinators. In this case, I am specifically talking about bees. And if you were, again, in a room with me together, I would ask you, maybe that's going to be a poll question for next time. So those of you who are here, pay attention. I would ask you, do you know how many bees species do we have in California? Normally I'll get an answer, something to the effect of, oh, I don't know, 20, maybe somebody brave will say 100. In fact, in California, there's an estimated about 1,500 different bee species just in California. You heard that right. In the United States, in the world, there's an estimate of about 20,000 different bee species. So that is quite a diverse group of bees. And the majority of those bees are actually ground dwelling. So they live and reproduce in the underground. So why are we here? Why are we interested in bees? Clearly, they are crucial for producing the food that we eat. And about 20 years ago or so, there was a book that came out, or maybe 15 years ago or so, there was a book that came out, and it was titled Status of Pollinators in North America. And it kind of painted a slightly bleak picture, but a truthful picture of the decline of pollinators and how we have been seeing a slight decline, or not a slight, but kind of a drastic decline of pollinators in the prior 20 years or so. So in addition to that book that came out, I think it was 2005, 2006, right around the time when I actually started working on honeybees. There's also a report that came out more recently, about 2015, 2016, if not a little bit later, and it was dubbed the Assessment Report on Pollinators, Pollination, and Food Production. And it was published by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this is a worldwide group and a forum of researchers, pollinator experts, that have come together and analyzed basically all of the understanding that we have so far on the value of pollinators to the ecosystem, including the agricultural systems, and also the fact that the pollinators are still in decline. And of course, there's a discussion of how climate change affects the pollinator declines as well. So it is a really quite a detailed and comprehensive view of what is going on with pollinators today. And it is actually freely available online. So if you really are interested in going deeper into this topic, I would highly recommend you visit this website and take a look at the report that was published. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about pollination, and pollination by honey, or pollination by bees specifically. When I was thinking about this presentation, I sort of wanted to put forth some of the information that you might not be familiar with, just because this is not something that you are encountering every day. And I wanted to give you sort of a comprehensive overview of how your food comes to be, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the bee pollination as well. And in addition to honeybees, we have other three widely used bees in commercial pollination. So these are bees that we as humans have figured out how to rear successfully in boxes usually, or oftentimes we figured out a way how to keep bees that are not necessarily in boxes, but to keep bees anchored to a specific site where we want the pollination to happen. So as I mentioned, in addition to honeybees, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with bumblebees. Bumblebees can be reared in a large commercial setting, and they come in boxes. They actually come in boxes, sort of like almost like a little shoebox, and you can put bumblebees inside a pollination or a crop that you want to pollinate, and they're quite commonly used for pollination inside the greenhouses. We also have alfalfa leaf cutting bee and alkali bee, and they're used for pollination of alfalfa. And the reasons to pollinate alfalfa is to produce seeds. So they're used quite often for production of alfalfa seeds. And another fun fact that folks don't often think about is that without bees, we always talk about fruits and nuts and vegetables. Without bees, we wouldn't have fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Without bees, we actually wouldn't have, ultimately, we probably wouldn't have access to milk or dairy products. So alfalfa is used to feed dairy cattle, right? And bees are used to pollinate alfalfa for seed production so we can plant more of it and we can actually have our dairy fed so we can get milk and then we can get ice cream. We can get all those delicious cheeses that are produced from dairy milk. Now, because I am an expert on honeybees, we're going to talk a little bit more and focus a little bit more on honeybees. And they really are the most essential managed pollinator. Now, when I say that, that means that honeybees are not, I often get this question, they're not, I wouldn't consider them, we don't necessarily consider them domesticated, right? They are a managed pollinator. So we as humans actually take care of them. They are in the box, we take care of them. And what's really useful for us is that we can actually easily move the colonies from crop to crop. They can be moved or covered if there's any, for example, need for pesticide application in the crop. Colonies also have a really high number of foraging individuals when they're out there getting the food for their developing brood, right? And they are generalists. So they don't actually depend on just any one plant specifically. They will go and collect pollen and nectar from a variety of different plant sources. However, they do exhibit resource constancy, which makes them a really successful pollinator of commercial crops, because what that means is once they find a food source, they'll keep going back to that food source until it's depleted, which means that if you place them in a crop area that has hundreds potentially of acres of just that specific crop, once they focus on that crop, they will stay there and they will keep going back to it. And by default, they will pollinate the crop. Now, honeybees in California, there are about approximately 700,000 colonies in California. As that's the latest or the estimate from mid of the year in 2018. So usually we have anywhere between, again, 500 to 700,000 colonies. However, that number changes drastically in January, starting in January. And I'm sure you can guess from this slide that you're seeing right now, it is due to pollination of almonds. Right now, I just heard this new number. California has about 1.5 million of acres of almonds. The recommended stocking rate for almond pollination is 2 colonies per acre. So when you think about that, that would come out to, if you do the math, that would come out to 3 million colonies that would be necessary for pollinating almonds successfully just in California alone. So this is why this number increases somewhere in January, because a lot of the folks, and I have a nice graphic that I will show you about the movement of honeybee colonies throughout the United States, but a lot of the commercial beekeeping folks will bring those colonies in the state of California and will place those colonies in almond orchards for pollination. Almond bloom starts somewhere mid-March. In fact, it's easy to remember. It's around Valentine's Day that normally the bloom begins. So in addition to almonds, which bring higher than about $6 billion value, so that's a tremendous economic impact on the state of California and California agriculture, honeybees in California are rented for additional 20 or so crops. And in fact, the California State Beekeepers Association does a pollination survey every year, and they have listed more than 20 different crops in addition to almonds, and that includes things like alfalfa, cherries, melons, especially early cherries, prunes, plums, strawberries, even sunflowers, vegetable seeds. So there's a variety of crops, even though the almond bloom is really the start of this pollination season here in California and really throughout the United States. There are many other crops that honeybees are used for in pollination. And this is just a nice graphic from Scientific American. Bees Without, it was from an article titled Bees Without Borders. And it sort of shows the movement of honeybee colonies throughout the United States. As you can see, a lot of them will go from other states, come into California, and then from California, after the almond pollination, they will go into pollinating other crops. A lot of the beekeepers will actually go into the Midwestern states and they'll start producing honey. A lot of the beekeepers will stay in California, for example, especially if they're local beekeepers. They will start producing bee packages. Um, Packages of bees are basically anywhere between 2 to 3 pounds of bees with a queen that are placed in a box and can be shipped to beekeepers who have maybe lost their bees or to those who might be interested in starting their own colonies. So we can produce bee packages. Quite a few beekeepers will produce queens. They will rear queens and they will sell those queens again throughout the United States and into Canada as well. And in fact, here in California, Northern California in particular, about an hour and a half away from, an hour and a half north from where I am at UC Davis, we have quite a few queen producers that actually produce over 1 million queens a year that supply the rest of the country pretty much. So if you think about the numbers of colonies that we have in the country, which is about 2.7 million, these beekeepers supply basically a third of the queens for the colonies in the United States. Now, in addition to the first question that I get asked, which is, have you been stung? And by the way, I should have answered a poll as well. Yes, I have been stung many times, as you can imagine, by honeybees and other bees as well. The second question that I get is, oh, how are honeybees doing these days? So I'll tell you a little bit about how honeybees are doing, or at least what the beekeepers are reporting. So this is a graph that is, as you can see, presents the colony losses for the past 10 or 11 years. In 2007, 2008, we started off, and I say we, in fact, it's a bee-informed partnership group that I have sort of partnered with most recently within the last 2 years, and I have a group of their members in my lab. So the Bee-Informed Partnership together with USDA has started a survey of beekeepers, basically asking them how many of their colonies are being lost every year. And when the survey first started, or the first couple of years of the survey, beekeepers were reporting upwards of 35 to 40% bee losses. And this is only over winter. So sometime in 2010, 2011, Bee-Informed Partnership started asking beekeepers, what are your colony losses in the summer as well? And when all of it is combined, you can see that annually, this is the darker orange line, in 2010-11, the beekeepers were losing again upwards of 35 colonies. That number jumps drastically, almost upwards to 50, closer to 50% in 2012 and 13. And the number sort of goes up and down, and there is really kind of no rhyme or reason why this is. And I will talk a little bit about some of the stressors that the honeybees are facing. But before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the colony collapse disorder, because this is sort of the buzzword that has originally started the interest in understanding better the pollinator decline, specifically honeybee declines. So what is colony collapse disorder, or CCD? It is a syndrome that's characterized by a specific set of symptoms. And the symptoms are rapid loss of adult workers with disproportionately high amount of brood or developing bees still remaining in the colony, as well as the queen. There is a lack of dead bees in and around the hive. And This last symptom, that's a little bit of more of an abstract symptom, if you ask me, it's the delayed invasion by hive pests and robbing of those hives by nearby bees. So bees will rob other colonies if they're in desperate need of food. They will try and take their nectar away. So these are the symptoms. However, in recent years, what we're noticing, specifically from the Bean-Form Partnership Survey, is that the beekeepers, a low number of beekeepers are now reporting colony collapse disorder as a driving factor for colony losses. And in fact, we'll talk about some of the other causes that are sort of seen as the top causes. So what is caused or what causes CCD? There have been a lot of hypotheses that were tested and thrown out there in the research world. For a while, we thought it was a virus. Then we thought maybe it was a nosema. We had nutritional stress. So a variety of factors have been proposed as a potential cause of colony collapse disorder. And at the end, what we really realized and understood better, both as researchers and beekeepers, is that most likely what has happened was that there was a synergistic effect of multiple factors, multiple of these factors that just sort of came together and created this perfect storm, causing die-off of bees. And this is actually a phenomenon that was present in the United States and a couple of other countries. I believe Switzerland was one of them. And I can't remember what the third one is. So it was sort of a geographically limited phenomenon. And again, it was thought to be synergistic effect of multiple factors. So what are those factors? Well, there are many of them. I'm not going to read all of them out separately, but I will go through some of the factors that we know can cause issues for bees and beekeepers. And then I will tell you a little bit about some of the work that we're doing in my lab trying to address those issues. And again, this is being recorded, so you can always go back and revisit the talk if you want to study the slide a little bit more. Pathogens, in terms of pathogens, bees are exposed to a variety of viruses. Probably, if you talk to beekeepers, they will tell you that the deformed wing virus is one of the viruses that is the bane of their existence, and it's transmitted by a parasite called Varroa mite. And deformed wing virus, as you can imagine, you can see it here in this photo, causes the deformity of the wing. And what that means, the bee cannot fly, so it cannot actually contribute as a forager eventually down the road to the colony. They also deal with bacterial pathogens. American foul brood is a disease that I actually have a nice little video of that you will see that because of it, if the beekeeper has American foul brood in their colonies, they in fact have to burn the equipment and get rid of the bees. So it is that bad and that easily spread. We have other fungal pathogens that the bees deal with. Some of them are called, one of them is called chalk brood, and it basically looks like mummified brood. We have nosema that causes either dwindling of bees or diarrhea, depending on the species. And I wanted to go into showing you a little video. And sometimes the videos don't work directly in the Zoom, but no worries. I've done this many times, so I will show you a video. This is a bee that was infected by us to study the effect of viruses on the bees. This was a bee that was infected by the Israeli acute paralysis virus, and it is a paralytic virus, which means that the bees, once infected with high enough dose, basically cannot right itself. So you can see that this is not, as you can imagine, a normal behavior of a bee, and the bee basically does not have ability to right itself. And the majority of those bees were in fact dead within 24 hours. In addition to viruses, as I mentioned, bees are exposed to pathogens, bacterial pathogens, and this is another video of that American foul brood disease. And this is me going into a diseased cell, right? This is a frame and a cell. And what this American foul brood pathogen does, it basically melts the larvae down. So when you put a toothpick, this is called a rope test. When you put a toothpick in, scramble the larvae, and you pull this rope, basically this larva ropes out by a couple of inches. So one of the questions that we have asked in our lab and in collaboration with our colleagues in Canada is, can probiotics be helpful? So are there other, basically other microorganisms or other bacteria that can in some way out compete the pathogen that causes American foul brood? And we have completed a study last year, again, with our colleagues from Canada, but here in California. I don't have the results of that study yet because COVID hit and the samples are still being processed, but there's some promise. And I'm not going to explain this graph into detail, but if you just focus on this graphic here, P. larvae is the causative agent of American foul brood, and the colonies that were fed the biopatty that had the probiotic clearly had a much lower pathogen load than those that were not fed the probiotic. So there's some really interesting, hopefully potentially useful data that we're going to be getting from our work with our collaborators from Canada that will be potentially useful to the beekeepers. There's, in fact, a lot of interest from beekeepers to feed these probiotics to the colonies to improve the health. Another sort of a compound that we're testing, or other compounds and other avenues of research that we're exploring, in this is particularly in collaboration with our colleague Dr. Rathi from USDA, is the use of phytochemicals. And in this particular study, we utilized caffeine, picomeric acid, and a couple of other, camphorol, for example, and a couple of other phytochemicals that are commonly found in the nectar of plants that the bees will forage on. So this is not something that we came up with randomly, but Arathi has found in her prior work that some of these chemicals can actually help the bees better deal with fungal pathogens. So of course, now our question is, can we have these bees respond better and improve their immune response to other pathogens as well? If you ask a beekeeper what is the bane of their existence when it comes to keeping bees, they will most likely say it is Varroa mites. Varroa mite is a parasite that feeds on the hemolymph, or the blood of the bees, and also more recent findings show that it actually feeds and seeks out the fat bodies of the bees. So it feeds on bees, it transmits the pathogens and suppresses the immune response of the bees as well. So again, beekeepers are really trying to suppress this pest, and we're trying to help them. So we partnered with a couple of our funding bodies, and we are testing a variety of different new or improved Varroa, so miticides that are used for controlling the Varroa mite. And again, this is just a graphic. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how effective this one of these novel applications is. So we've done some of the laboratory studies on an essential oil, and this is our negative control, which basically is the mites that have not been treated with anything. And then we have mites that have been treated with a really high dosage of this essential oil. So here, 40%. And within 5 minutes in this petri dish, we actually got all 100% mortality of those mites. So we had positive laboratory results. We took it out into the field. We had some promising, I guess, again, results with this study as well in the field, or with this compound. So we'll be continuing that work to develop further the dosages and the timing of this miticide, in hopes to provide another tool for the beekeepers they can use to support their bees in fighting off Varroa. Another tool, again, in addition to a Varroa that we're trying to work towards providing to the beekeepers, is understanding the variety of bee stocks that are developed for Varroa resistance and tolerance. So my student Lauren is working on evaluating several different stocks that are again have been bred and produced for being resistant for Varroa mites. And the reason she's evaluating these is she wants to see how they do in this particular area, so in Northern California. And she also wants to see if there is any resistance of these different bee stocks to pathogens and potentially pesticides as well. And pesticides are something that the bees are, as you can imagine, exposed to when they go out into, especially in the agricultural areas, when they go out to forage and bring back the food. And those can sometimes negatively impact the colony. Nutrition. So we're switching gears a little bit and we're talking a little bit more about some of the solutions that we are potentially developing for bees and beekeepers. And we know now that nutrition is really crucial to honeybee health because it can improve the immune responses and detoxification responses of bees to pathogens and, of course, pesticides. So bees are often, when they do crop pollination, are placed in an area of a monoculture. This is an orchard, almond orchard. And we know that bees, just like us humans, need a variety of nutrients from a variety of sources. So what we're studying in my lab group in collaboration with a couple of other colleagues is how different foraging mixes, so plant mixes, when planted around the almond orchards, can support honeybee health. And again, these are the two mixes that were developed by Project TAPISM and also Neil Williams' lab group. We've completed the research in 2017, 2018 in Colusa County, where we placed the colonies, multiple colonies in the orchards with and without supplemental forage. And the colonies were evaluated before, during, and after the almond bloom. After the almond bloom, they were all placed back on UC Davis property in 2017, and in 2018, we split them between California and Oregon, and we continued to monitor them for a variety of parameters. So, for example, we tracked the pollen that they were using, so we know that they were indeed foraging on the plants that we were interested in understanding better. Of course, we tracked them for growth, so adult population as well as the brood production by the queen. We tracked them for several health parameters, including the Varroa mite infestation and pathogen loads. And of course, what the beekeepers oftentimes will tell you, the most important thing to them, they don't care about any of this other stuff. They want to know how well the colonies survive based on what they're being fed, basically. So we tracked the colonies again for all of those parameters and the survivorship. We have encountered challenges in both years, as you can imagine. So we had a really wet year, both years. In fact, one of the years was really cold and had frost. So what that meant was that we really weren't able to have the wildflower mix evaluated. However, we still had the mustard mix evaluated. These are just some of the highlights for the first year. The 2017 colonies indeed did better, and they produced more brood and they produced higher adult population, significantly so, if they were in the presence of mustard plantings in addition to almonds. And that was true for at least 2 different time points during the almond bloom. So again, a variety of supplemental forage or a variety of food sources indeed does help the bees. Seemingly didn't have much of an impact on the viruses and other pathogens that we tested. And it sort of didn't have, and if you look at the graphics, there's no trend that really emerges. But as I pointed out earlier, what the beekeepers really care about is the survivorship. So I'll tell you in 2018, again, highlights, but it was very similar trends in 2017. In terms of survivorship, those colonies that were in the presence of mustard plantings, it's a red line, as compared to the colonies that were only present with the almond bloom, did survive longer, and more of them survived, again, than if they didn't have the presence of those additional nutrients. And in fact, not only did they survive, but it's seemingly that effect wasn't only an immediate effect, immediate positive effect, but there was also a long-term or longer-term effect of access to additional supplemental forage, in our case, again, mustard plantings. And the bees that had early access to those mustards, produced higher brood and higher frames of adult bees, which lasted well into November. And we're in November now. The bees are now in their overwintering phase, and the beekeepers are really keeping their fingers crossed that those colonies survive. And the higher the number of frames of bees that go into overwintering, the greater the chances that those colonies will survive. So we have a healthy pollination supply the following year. So it is all very, very connected, right? We're all part of a larger ecosystem. Now, in addition to understanding how we can improve the forage for the bees, we also want to see what might be an exposure of these bees to pesticides. So we also have a project in collaboration with Neil Williams and Eric Lastro in Minnesota, University of Minnesota, as well as USDA. USDA Davis Bee Lab, where we were tracking and collecting pollen from 20 different locations in Yolo, Colusa, and Solano counties. And that pollen is going to be analyzed for pesticides, as well as nutrient analysis will be accomplished. And the colonies are also tracked for these different health parameters. So that is still to be determined. My question always is, can we do even better in addition to just understanding what is killing the bees, right? Or what is negatively affecting the bees? Can we actually develop additional pesticides, for example, for the growers that might be softer and easier on the bees? So this is work being done in collaboration with my colleagues Flo Truillas and Rachel Vanette at UC Davis. And we are currently exploring the potential for novel biocontrol of one of the pathogen diseases in almonds, and that is brown rot. So the end game for me, at least, and how I got involved in this is that we can then potentially use these new microorganisms for controlling the pests in different cropping systems with using bees. So the idea is that the bees, these are bumblebees, of course, but the bees will walk through a dispenser that has the biocontrol microorganism placed inside, pick it up on their feet. So you can see here, you can pick it up on their hairy legs. And then they fly out to forage and pollinate, and then they deliver this biocontrol microorganism to the plants and thereby controlling the pathogen. So it's a really neat and very exciting idea to me. And again, that's how I got involved in it to begin with. But I also just wanted to show you another little quick video of a bee that is completely, you got to pay really close attention. And there she is. She goes completely white, covered in that powder that has the biocontrol microorganism in it. And she's still flying. So again, a bumblebee. This is a field of raspberries in Serbia. And you can see this was in May. It's really wet and it's really cool. But that bumblebee is still going out to forage, which is a really neat characteristic of bumblebees. They can go out and forage when the honeybees are sort of hunkering down and not doing much pollination. But the bee was off and we tracked her, and we in fact collected the flowers that she visited to make sure that she delivered the microorganism, and she really did. We actually were able to plate the microorganism, the biocontrol microorganism, back out of the flowers. So I'm going to stop with some of the research that we're doing there, but I did want to finish off my presentation by mentioning that one of our great successes for the lab was the establishment of the California Master Beekeeper program, which is kind of akin to the Master Gardener program that you might be familiar with. And the idea is to use science-based information to educate the stewards and ambassadors for honeybees and beekeeping. So the folks who are within the program go through classes and rigorous testing, and then they basically provide volunteer hours for their communities. So they give back to their communities by providing volunteer hours, and they help us. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the only state extension specialist for apiculture or for beekeeping. So it's really valuable to me to have well-educated stewards and ambassadors for bees and beekeeping, and those who can be in local communities answering questions and helping others. And we also do quite a bit of work with children. And I'm always excited about working with kids because, as I like to say, they're so excited about everything that I talk to them about, and they never fall asleep on me. So we have a pollinator education program, or PEP, in the Haagen-Dazs Honeybee Haven, which is a bee garden or pollinator garden at UC Davis, which has approximately 250 different pollinator supportive plant species. Most of them are California native and they're drought tolerant. So I would highly recommend, if you have a chance to visit the garden, come and visit us. And the garden is especially beautiful in May. And again, this is the site of a lot of our educational programs for the community and especially for the younger generations. So I want to thank all of our donors, contributors, all of those who are working really, really hard to keep the program going, and all of those who have helped us accomplish all of the research and education goals that we have had so far. And I always get a question of how you can help. And we always say you can provide, you don't need to be a beekeeper to help bees, right? But you can also always provide food sources for bees by planting bee-friendly landscapes. And we have a lot of information on that, again, at the Haagen-Dazs Honeybee Haven website. You can dare to go bare. It sounds very daring, right? But what we really mean by that, I also mentioned in the presentation that majority of the bees that we have in California are actually ground dwelling. So instead of putting asphalt or concrete down, if you're improving your backyard, for example, or even putting pavers down, make sure that you leave some patches of empty or uncovered dirt so those bees can go in and reproduce. And then if you can avoid spraying, especially in your garden, and if it's just sort of for aesthetic, if you can avoid spraying with pesticides, that does help the bees quite a bit. And of course, we're doing some really great research. As I said, I'm working on a variety of things that, and a variety of projects that are helping beekeepers hopefully down the road. And also my colleagues are helping contribute to our broader knowledge and understanding of other bees. So not just honeybees and other pollinators in general, as I said, hummingbirds, for example. So there's a variety of accounts you can, or a variety of projects that you can help support. So for example, these are the projects in my lab. This is directly supporting projects in the Laidlaw facility. This one, for example, is helping support our Master Beekeeper program. So again, we're very, very grateful for our donors, and we really wouldn't be able to do a fraction of this research and the education and extension that we're doing without a variety of our great funders and donors. And I'm going to end here by spotlighting my child. This is my firstborn, Sebastian, and he has a little brother, Rafa, and they're clearly already very experienced beekeepers, and they're fearless. It's amazing. They would stick their head directly into the colony and check out the bees. So if you have any questions, I'd like to open it up and hopefully invite Christy to help me with answering some of the questions that you've posed in the chat or the Q&A box. And if I don't answer your question, or in case you didn't have time to write down the question, you can always feel free to email me. And this is my email address, elnino@ucdavis.edu. And with that, I'd like to, of course, thank you all for being here and for supporting the bees, right? And of course, again, I'm going to hand it over to Christy, and hopefully we can answer some questions together. Thank you.
Fabulous presentation. I can pretty much assure you, I don't think anybody fell asleep.
Well, good. I'm glad.
And we've got about
Thank
10
you.
minutes and over 20 questions. So we'll try to get through these as best as possible to get as many answered as possible. Someone says they came from South Africa and where they were avoiding bees because they stung you and they learned to run away from bees. But their question is, have the African bees invaded Northern California? And if so, how are we dealing with it?
No. So the bees that we have here are a hybrid bee, a hybrid mixture of African bee species or subspecies and then European subspecies. And we definitely do have those in California. We call them Africanized honeybees. We like to not call them killer bees, but they can be more defensive of their colonies and their hives. We do, as I said, have them in California. A majority of them are found in Southern California. And we did have a couple of researchers, I mentioned them at the beginning, Santiago and Brian. They have done work where they tested bees that they've collected from down south and all the way up to Davis area, for example. And majority, as I said, are found down south. We do have some hits on maybe a single individual bee that was collected that was present around the area of Sacramento, for example, and Contra Costa County, but nothing in Davis, for example, was found and not further up north either. So they're here. I don't know that we're ever probably going to be able to get rid of them, but we can definitely put in place some sort of restrictions and best management practices to keep them from going back up or going further up north.
That sounds promising. Great. So somebody's asking, how do you differentiate between bee species?
So we cannot differentiate between bee species or subspecies.
Well, she said species.
Species.
So let's go with
Okay.
that.
So if we're talking about bee species, there's a variety of usually physical characteristics that can help with identifying different species. And I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but hopefully you caught a glimpse of that one slide that had really nice, colorful pictures of those bees. So that's the first place where the beekeepers or not beekeepers, but entomologists and those who work with bees start. So they look for physical characteristics. And then, of course, there's a lot to do with natural history as well. So some of the, even just if you look at the size, right, think about honeybees versus bumblebees and how different they look. So again, we have a variety of different characteristics that are usually visible to our eye between the different species that we can tell them apart. And then some of them are microscopic. So a lot of the times the systematists will use microscopy to look at the bees up close. And of course, we have molecular tools that can help us decipher between the different species of bees by looking at their genetics.
Who knew? So are yellow jackets a form of bees?
No, yellow jackets are a wasp. So they're definitely a wasp. They're related to bees. They're all in order Hymenoptera, but they're definitely not bees. And you're right, people do often confuse them with bees. They're what we call meat eaters. So they actually go after the, for example, in our colonies, we get yellow jackets quite often because they try to invade the colony and steal the brood from the honeybees, but they are not a bee, they are a wasp. And you can sort of tell the wasps from the bees by the waist. They have a thinner waist than the bee, for example.
So they don't do any honey production. They're just out.
No honey production. The
trouble.
species of bees that the species of bees that produce honey are the honeybees as we know them, the Western honeybee. And then there are stingless bees that also produce honey, but we don't have them in North America. They're usually down South America, South Central America, and then in Africa as well. So those are sort of the two groups that produce honey.
Okay. Someone's said they've seen online boxes where you don't need to lift up the combs, but instead they have a spigot on them. Are you familiar with those and used any of those?
Yes, I am familiar with that. And of course, now the name escapes me, but the idea was the frames were designed in such a way that you basically, as you said, turn a spigot. And what it does, it breaks the seal, wax seal that the honeybees put over a cell that's filled with honey. So it breaks that seal and it lets, or flow hive, that's what it is. And it lets the honey flow from the cells and into a I think they used a jar in the videos, right? There was a lot of hype about that, and it seemed really, really cool. I can tell you that we had several beekeepers get the flow hive, and it just never really took off for them. For some reason, the bees were not really excited, and we had it in our educational apiary. And for us, the bees just never seemed really excited about putting the honey into those frames. And also, one of the biggest questions and concerns that we had was that the beekeeper, that sort of sends a message of set it and forget it mentality, right? That wasn't there like a Ronco set it and forget it chicken spinner thing, whatever, grill. So that was sort of the mentality. You set it and forget it. And what happens is you saw that the bees have quite a few stressors that can actually be managed to a point by a beekeeper. So the worry was that these folks who don't have any beekeeping experience will bring the bees in, they will put these frames on and just not check their colonies at all to see if they have any diseases. The problem with that is, sure, your colony is going to probably die if you don't do anything with it to manage the diseases and the pests. But that's not the only issue. The issue is those colonies that are ridden with pests and diseases. When they start dying, the bees will start leaving the colony and going to other colonies. So you basically are producing these little, what we call mite bombs. Dennis Van Engelsdorp, I think, this came up with that name. These mite bombs that basically spread the mites to other colonies and other beekeepers. So you're just kind of amplifying the problem. So yes, I know about the flow hive. We have it in our educational apiary. I can't say I recommend it or don't recommend it, but we just haven't had really successful experience with it. And if you do have it and you get the colonies with those frames, make sure that you do check your colonies for pests, diseases, and actually manage them and not just forget about them.
Fascinating. So somebody's asking, how big is the international bee transportation business?
Ooh, how big is it? Well, we don't really allow anything into the country. So, in terms of that, not very big for whoever would like to bring in stuff into the country. We export, we don't ship bees to other countries. We ship queens to other countries mostly, but there's, I believe, a lot more movement in, for example, Europe, let's say, versus in the United States, from the United States into Europe. That's just not possible. So we try to keep our bees where they are because of this potential for disease spread and Varroa mite spread. So Australia, as far as I know, is still the only country in the world that does not have Varroa mites, for example. And I can't imagine that they would want the Varroa mites. So it's kind of restrictive in terms of preventing, again, disease spread and pest spread. But I have no idea. I have no numbers. If you're talking about economics, I have no numbers for you whatsoever. I don't know if anybody does. Somebody must have, but I don't.
Okay. So somebody's asking, how do you care for the bees when they're not gathering pollen? Like, do they have nutrition requirements? Do they need water, that kind of thing?
Yes, they absolutely do need a variety of things. And you're correctly stated, they need water. So we'll recommend beekeepers provide a water source for the bees and provide a water source that the bees can access without drowning. So for example, if it's a tub of water, put sand in it so the bees can actually land on the sand and take the water that they need and fly away without drowning. In terms of when there is a drought, for example, or dearth period in California, we can provide supplemental nutrition in form of carbohydrate supplements. There's a variety of those available on the market. We also do provide things like pollen supplements, so protein supplements, and there's a variety of those on the market as well. And a lot of the beekeepers will actually make their own protein supplement. A lot of the times they'll use brewer's yeast or soy protein to make sure that the bees get the protein they need to produce the brood and help them stay healthy. Now, none of those match what the plants can provide and actual pollen can provide, because it's not just about the protein, it's about a variety of micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals that the bees also need. So we're still working as sort of a collective group of beekeepers and researchers on developing that optimal pollen supplement for the bees.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question real quick. What happens to the dead bees in the hive?
Oh, that's a great question. I love it. The other bees will drag them out. So, yeah, it's a really interesting. They're they're good housekeepers. The bees are. So they have what we call undertaker bees, and they will find the dead bees that die in the hive, and they will drag them out, and they'll actually try and drag them out further away and drop them off further away from the colony, so that disease potentially that has killed them is not sitting in the colony. Oftentimes, diseased bees will actually do altruistic behavior where they leave the colony and they will die outside of the colony as well. So they have undertakers. Yeah.
Okay, sounds great. Well, Elena, this has been absolutely fascinating.
Well,
I've got a
thank you.
couple of friends that are in beekeeping. I'll be sending them
Perfect.
a copy of this recording. And thank you so very much. We'll turn this back over to our master of ceremonies.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Christy, for all the great questions.
You bet.
Thank you, Elina. That was really interesting. This presentation's been recorded. So if any of you would like to be able to go back and rehear parts of it that went by too quickly, if you'd like to stop and look at the graphs, we have a channel on YouTube, and the link to that is on the Renaissance Society website. And it also is in the emails that we send out. Next week is our last presentation. Oh, I'm sorry, not next week. 2 weeks from today will be Ken Cross, who is the president of the Renaissance Society. Ken will be talking about the past, present, and our vision for the future. So hope you all can attend that. And thank you, Dr. Niño, and thank you everyone who came.